theology that exists around grief, grieving. But questions that you have, further thoughts you have from some of the readings you've done, while you're thinking about that, I think the way we're going to do this, because Thursday we usually have groups anyway, but the Board of Trustees is in here, so we will tackle, well, let me ask you this. How many of you guys, and be honest, Jesus is watching, how many of you guys have gotten through a grief observed? What is that? Like, I'm almost pregnant or something? What? It's either you're pregnant or you're not. I'm done or I'm not. So, what, 6 people? Yeah, maybe. All right, I want you to be able to get that done before we watch the movie. Okay, so make a point to get that done over the weekend, because then on Tuesday we will start the movie. It's not a real long book, so that probably should be able to get through some of it. What that also means is that we'll watch a portion of the movie because we don't have enough time in this class. And then I will have it on Blackboard for you to watch the rest of it. So wherever we finish, it'll be queued up for you to finish on Blackboard. And then when we get back the following Tuesday, we'll kind of debrief and talk about it and see what your thoughts are. I wanted to set it up in such a way so that you were finished with the book as a context for what you're going to see in the movie itself. And so it kind of backs up a little bit in terms of what you guys are reading, because what you're reading is the aftermath. But a number of folks have been commenting on just the depth of love that you see C.S. Lewis having for joy, and this movie does, I think, a pretty good job at kind of giving you an inside look as to what that was about and how it went and all that kind of stuff. So once you get the book out of the way, then we can take you back in time, watch what you see, and then go from there. It's a really good movie. It's out of print, out of publication, or whatever they call it. Anthony Hopkins does a really, really good job, I think, at portraying C.S. Lewis. The only thing some critics would suggest is that he was, at least in this portrayal, he wasn't nearly as bombastic as C.S. Lewis was. Apparently, the legend, what I heard around Oxford is that you always knew where C.S. Lewis was because his voice was so booming. If you walked into the building, you'd know what classroom he was in, basically. So he and J.R. Tolkien were very good friends, and apparently, again, a little inane, stupid trivia that you might use in a game, is that apparently Treebeard was fashioned off of C.S. Lewis. So Treebeard was very loud. He was an ant. He was part of a race that was the oldest living things, and Tolkien was kind of a salute to C.S. Lewis and his friendship with him that was part of that story. So anyway, stupid inane comments and trivia that none of you care about. So any questions, reactions, conversations you've had, thoughts you've had in terms of some of the stuff you're reading? What reading? Okay, well let me pray and then we'll walk our way through some of these myths. Father, we hand this time over to you, ask you to guide and direct, that your Holy Spirit would open our hearts to be open to what you have for us, even as we look at not only the side of experiencing whatever losses that are represented in a room like this, but also just the sensitivity necessary to walk alongside others as well. And I pray that you'll bring that to our attention and just give us the grace necessary to learn instead of just beating ourselves up and assuming that we just can't ever get it right. Allow us to learn that and use it in grace with our relationships with each other. So in Jesus' name, amen. All right. So myths of grief. The one thing one comment I kind of hold out here for you guys is the idea that whenever we talk about mythology, one of the reasons that it is so powerful is that it is a mixture of truth and falsehood. And that's particularly true even in the things that we're going to talk about as far as grief is concerned, is there is a mixture of truth and falsehood. The problem is when we abide by these myths, they set us up then for our evaluation of how we grieve according to the myth, rather than pulling apart what is it that's true, what is it that is not true. So that's one of the key things to keep in mind when we're looking at these things, because they will come up. Now, the other thing I will mention is not only is it a mixture of falsehood and truth, but it also is a part of what goes on in your head. Not that I reside there, but there is plenty that conclusions we make based on this mythology that shows up in us and oftentimes silences us about the things that we experience around these things. So there are a couple different things just to highlight those for you to make sure. So what I have is a dozen of them. And the first one we're going to start with is you can only grieve so long and then you have to get on with your life. Grief takes a specific length of time to recover. The idea here that I have heard innumerable times is you can only grieve so long, so get over it and get on with it. And the funny thing about that is, I don't think that we would walk into any hospital room and look at somebody in a hospital bed and say, you're convalescing too long. Get over it, get out, we need this bed. We would never even remotely think about doing that or saying that. But when it comes to something as uncomfortable as our grief, something as uncomfortable as loss, because those things tend to throw us into a landscape of we don't know where we are and how do we function and what do we do and the nature of all those things. So our response to it is then get on with your life, which says something, okay? And with each of these myths that we look at, I think you have to pay attention to some of the key phrases. Because one of the things is, then you have to get on with your life. So what does that mean about grief? Has my life come to a standstill? Because the perspective about grief is somehow it's separate from life, rather than embedded in life. It's part of the losses that we experience all the time. There are lots of times the losses that we experience that are kind of a rehearsal for some of the more extensive or big losses that we experience. And that's that's the one thing in here that oftentimes you see. The other thing that comes out of this mythology is the idea of you can only grieve so long. What does that imply? What does that imply? We'll try to be as interactive as we can. What does it suggest? Neurons, wake up. I know it's 1:40. Hang with me here, folks. What does it mean? Yeah. Expiration date. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it suggests there is a specific amount of time it should take. And the funny thing about it is we say that with ourselves, we say that with other people. The thing is most of the time we would say, well, I'm not that insensitive. I wouldn't say something as rude as that. But when I start asking the kinds of questions of somebody that's experiencing loss and saying, how's it going? Are we, when do you feel like this is finally going to be over, in whatever phrase we use, we're implying this. And we do it to ourselves as well. I'm really tired. I've heard a lot of people say this one. I am really tired of just feeling so bad for so long. And usually I think ultimately our response has to be, yeah, I understand. Not, well, it only takes so long. Usually it's only 18 months to 2 years. What's the big deal? You know, it'll be over in that amount of time. And the moment we put a timeline to it is the moment that we start saying, it's not okay where I'm at. And if we're going to heal, ultimately from grief, we end up having to figure out a way. Maybe we have other people in our life that are saying that say, where you are is where you are. That's fine. It's okay. The problem is that a lot of times when we say that's fine to somebody, we're afraid that what we're saying is stay there. When we're not. We're really not. But there's a lot about this process, even whether you're walking with somebody or in it, that we want to, like I put up on the board the last time, we want to control the pain. And because of that then, cutting it short is one way to control the pain. This is just cut it short and stop. And, and a lot of times at that moment in time is oftentimes where the most healing potentially can occur, is rather than cutting it short. So, Alan, you had your hand up. Over here.
I think you touched on it already. I was just going to say, isn't it natural for us to have a desire for that to end at some point? Like, because it does naturally feel like it does inhibit life from moving forward. So I don't know, my question is it like inherently wrong to desire the pain to stop?
No, I think I think that would probably be a certain form of delusional disorder that would want the pain to keep going.
Yes.
So I think that's a natural in terms of just our being as a human being, that I want whatever hurts to stop.
So we should just naturally desire to like let it run its course rather than put a time date on it.
Yes, I would be really careful with the word should.
Okay.
Is giving myself permission to let it run its course would probably be better. But our tendency is to get a little too imperative with, well, this is how it should go. And usually I'm always going to lose on that comparison, usually. So, so the other thing I'd highlight for you in this particular myth is generally from a loss to death, grief, if it is allowed and the person works through some of it, generally there is a period of time where the most work of grief is done. Okay? So 18, like I said, 18 months to 2 years, that's not unusual at all for people to experience. The band is a lot bigger than we would prefer it to be. I mean, most of the time we say, instead of 18 to 2 years, I'd rather have it be 0 to 2 years. And then I can be done in 6. And the challenge in a lot of this stuff is which you all are catching because you've been writing about it in your journals, is grief is so uniquely individual that if I'm going to walk alongside of somebody, I better know the individual I'm engaged with if I'm going to walk alongside of them at all. Because otherwise I'm just going to spout some platitude that as my daughter so eloquently put it, you can go out to any Christian bookstore and get it and put it up on your wall. But we tend to be filled with those when it gets a little uncomfortable. So the second one, it is not Christian to grieve. Now again, there's a lot of mythology around this one. A lot of times there is some implication that somehow your faith is flawed if you're going to grieve because you're not taking God's word specifically enough in terms of grieving, but with hope. The thing about that, even that phrase that Paul uses in 1 Thessalonians is, to grieve but not as one without hope. Really is the way it's stated. So what is the qualifier? But not without hope. We may have a hard time wrapping our arms around that. But let's be really clear. He doesn't say, don't grieve. He doesn't say that. He says to grieve. And with an understanding, perhaps even a commitment to trusting what God is up to and God's heart is up to, even in the loss that I'm experiencing and what that ever looks like. But in a lot of cases, we look at ourselves even and have this propensity for thinking that whenever I feel whatever the emotions are, they don't feel good, and if they don't feel good, then there must be something wrong with my faith. And again, I'd point you back to all the time to Job and watch Job, because he puts on broad display the full range of emotions around the experiences of the loss he had. I think most of us would find it very difficult to experience the kind of loss Job had, because it was not only his health, it was his entire family outside of his wife, and he probably wished that she'd probably gotten struck too, because she was always saying, just give up your integrity and curse God and die. There's a real loving spouse for you. So there's that aspect of it, that there's nothing unchristian about it. And if that were the case, then why would there ever be instances throughout the Bible of people grieving? And instances where, even if you were to go to the Gospels, where Jesus visits people that are grieving. Mary and Martha being the primary ones you can point to, but you can look to a lot of them. You know, the Jewish temple official that comes to Jesus because his daughter has died. And when you really look at it and think about it, Jesus entered these worlds of people that were experiencing grief and didn't say, don't grieve. I mean, if anything, it moved him to see people grieve because of the effect of sin and how broken our world is, and even in a lot of cases our bodies. So Paul's not saying don't grieve. He is not connecting it to somehow there's something wrong with my faith in terms of what I do. Here's another one. Those who mourn are weak in their faith. Well, I think it's safe to say that those who mourn struggle with their faith. It does not make them weak. The challenge here is a couple different things. One is an understanding of what mourning actually looks like. You know, our society and our culture doesn't embrace this notion at all, which we've talked about and you've read in a number of your readings. I think one of the reasons that my book ends up keeping its allure to people is that we spend a lot of time normalizing and validating the emotions that people feel about being confused and weak and doubting and all the other things. You've watched, those of you guys who have read C.S. Lewis, it's doubt on display for somebody that had no doubts. I mean, this is the same dude that wrote Mere Christianity. The same guy that was talking about problem of pain. It's all the same person, and he's expressing these emotions and thoughts in A Grief Observed that we're saying, holy cow, he's just given words to something I was thinking. So in a lot of cases, the idea of that somehow we're weak in our faith, if anything, there's a greater degree of trust by allowing ourselves to mourn than there is the other way around. Because we trust the process of how God designed us. He designed us for two things, bonding and grieving. Because bonding goes with grieving. And there was a graphic I saw the other day, and that is grief fills the space where love was. And that's a part of what we have to look at and understand. Again, how do I make sense of it is a pain control statement. And it must be that the only reason that this happens at all is because there's something wrong with my faith. or I'm too weak in the faith, or I don't pray enough, or I don't say the right things, or I didn't go to church enough, or whatever. It's all a bunch of trades. I do this and then God saves the person. And if God didn't save the person, then there must be something I did wrong. And that's what a lot of this mythology does, and it tyrannizes us in a lot of ways when we're talking about it and looking at it. So the other part of this is that if I am weak in my faith, what does that mean for my process of engaging mourning at all? Yeah, Kath?
Just kind of backtracking a tiny bit, where you said the quote of grieving fills the spot where love was.
Yeah.
I don't really agree with that, because like when someone dies, you can still love them after. I don't think it's like filling a space.
Yeah, well, that's the hazard of a soundbite like that, right? I mean, it falls apart in the face of that. It doesn't say that love is absent, really. I mean, I'm not going to defend the graphic. I don't know who made it, but I think kind of the point is the connection between love and grief is really what the point is, and that sort of thing. So love created the bond, and grief expresses when the bond is broken. And that's where it shows up. Yeah. Yes.
So this is like the myth that comes from the idea that like those who have faith can like heal people, or that like if you have enough faith, like God will heal them. But like when God doesn't, it's like your lack of faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean it's always a cause and effect kind of thing. So if I had enough faith, then they wouldn't have died. And really, if you go back to it and look at what we were talking about with the anger turned inward, is the if onlys. Is that if I had done this, then this wouldn't have turned out, except that we just add a spiritual dimension to it. If I had prayed enough, then this person wouldn't have died. And or you know, if I had been faithful enough, then I wouldn't have lost this relationship, you know, rather than thinking just in death alone. So, yeah, there's always this connection, and it's usually a false connection that's made, but generally that's how we tend to kind of articulate these things, is we're looking for connection to explain the pain that we're in. And the way to do that is then connect up things that don't really belong being connected up at all. So, any other questions or anything so far? Okay, another one. You should wait to let the grieving person tell you when he or she needs something. Now, obviously we're talking about a myth. So we're already flying in the face of something that is not true. It's not good enough, I think, ultimately, when we're talking about mythology, to say, well, here's the myth and it's not true. That really isn't good enough. Because underneath it all, there's something that also points to something else we have to pay attention to. The one thing that generally you will find, and I think in my book we mentioned this a little bit as well, is that in some cases when somebody is grieving, experienced a loss, it is a boulder too big for them to carry alone. Okay, you guys all know that imagery that I use when I'm talking about boundaries, right? Being responsible to versus being responsible for and with somebody. And that is certainly the case when we're talking about here. So when somebody is carrying something so big, so crushing, they can't think of what their needs might be. So saying to somebody, just let me know if you need anything. And in a lot of cases, what goes through that person's mind is, I have no idea what I need. What I've experienced has blacked out all of what I would normally consider important needs to pay attention to. And so we end up inadvertently, I know a lot of people are very well-meaning when they say this, but we end up leaving the person who's grieving on an island. And it's like the only way that you can get any help is you call the person up. Versus the things that maybe are better to do is what could this person need right now? and offering it to them. The one thing I've had a lot of grieving people say is that it feels good to have somebody think about and even remember the person I've lost, and ask questions, or talk about it, or reminisce, or anything like that. And they're not generally going to know what they need. Now, that has to shift at some point in time for them to start taking more and more responsibility, but we can't push that envelope faster than they're ready to do it. Something I said in my crisis and trauma class, and I'd say that here, is that if I'm going to walk alongside somebody, then I need to match their pace, not me set the pace and them keep up. And that's true with grieving too, is we have to match their pace in what they need, and maybe think for them, because they don't think about that at all, particularly when you see people that have experienced a loss to death. It blacks out their thought about themselves at all. That's why we talked a little bit about self-neglect and some of the things that show up when people are grieving. The other side of that coin is that is every bit as true. Maybe not quite so profoundly because the person has died, but it's every bit as true in other losses. I lose a status or a role, or I lose a relationship with somebody. People get distracted because they're living in their heads. And when they live in their heads, they're not thinking about their physical needs, like going for a walk or something really very simple. So offering is offered from good intentions, completely good intentions. It's not bad. But the problem is you're asking somebody who's already wounded to think about what's going on for themselves. And sometimes that's just a really tall order, one. The second one that I think you have to keep in mind is the one that we just talked about before, is if I ask, then what does that make me? And usually the answer is, I'm afraid of appearing weak. I'm afraid of being overwhelmed by the emotions that I have. And it's not funny, but it's kind of ironic how many people I've talked to since I've been doing this class, some of the folks that have heard me in the other class, when I talk about the whole idea of tears, and I still have people wrestling with the minute the tears start showing up on their cheeks, they're apologizing for it. And that's a signal of what? Weakness. It's not a signal of humanity. It's a signal of weakness. And so even understanding or assessing what I need is another kind of weakness, that I need some other people. And I'm not sure I want to do that because that makes me feel weak, and I don't want to appear weak, and I don't want to be needy, I don't want to be dependent, I don't want to. And I forget about asking, what do I want and what do I need as well. So another one is this, is grieving people would rather talk about the person they have lost. I was stuttering at that moment. They would rather not talk about the person that they've lost. Now, let me take you back to another discussion we had last week or the week before. And I put a timeline up, a life timeline up, right? And the loss occurs, and there's a dropout in that timeline. And then we go on about our business, but there's still a huge, huge gap there. And Vivian asked me the question about, what do we do with that, and what is that? And I said, that's called a scar. Y'all remember that conversation? How do I reweave history and my understanding of it and what happened in it and the person that was in it, except if I talk about it? I have to reconstruct my history when there is a blowout there. And so a lot of times you will see it with older people that end up, the older they get, the more people they have lost. And what do they tend to talk about? Their past, the people that they have lost. And we say, I've heard that story 100 times, Grandma. Her new reality right now requires, at some level, to reincorporate what's happened way back then. We do that too. I have to reprocess it. I have to weave it into the fabric of the timeline of my life. And if that's done reasonably well, the timeline looks pretty good. There's a scar, just like we talked about, but it looks pretty good. It doesn't look bad. The only thing is on the underneath side, you know there's something there. One example sometimes I'll give is that, imagine for a moment that you walk into a really, really nice house and they have this massive Persian rug on the wall. And sometime later, the people that own this house get burglarized. And they clean out the house, except that the burglars or the thieves that come through, they don't just burglarize the house. On the way out, clearly, they take a shotgun and shoot a hole in the Persian rug. If you're familiar with a shotgun, it's made up of a very small amount or a big cartridge full of BBs, right? It frays things. I mean, if somebody takes a rifle to it, it's one hole and that's it, and you can repair it. But now we've got a frayed wound in that rug. So what do? I find a way to take it to somebody who can reweave it on the back side so that it looks as good as it did before the rug was ruined. Every time you turn that rug over, you will see the reweaving. And in a lot of cases, that's the same thing we have to do with our own timelines, is the reweaving of me in it and what it meant and who it was and what I experienced and how I felt those things. It's very much a part of the healing process. And so to think that they would rather not, and we do that, right? I don't want to talk about it because why? This is your turn.
It makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, it makes me uncomfortable, or I don't want them to feel bad. And in a lot of cases, for a lot of people, it's like, well, at least somebody remembers this person besides just me. I had one lady I worked with who was a widow. Her husband passed away. She was probably married to him 40 years. And he had a prolonged illness and finally died, and she was home alone. Kids growing up, they were gone. And so some friends came over to take her out for dinner, and they were friends of her and her former husband. And so they were, couple friends. And as they were driving, the husband, they passed a restaurant, and the husband started reminiscing about having coffee with her husband there. And she came into counseling and was reporting this, and I said, how'd that feel? And she said, finally I found somebody that remembered my husband like I do. And it makes it real. There's validation in allowing people to talk about it. It doesn't make it worse. Now, the wild card in some of that is not necessarily death, but other kinds of losses. And even then, we probably need to talk about it. You've probably been around enough people that have had withered relationships or lost or broken relationships, and it seems like that's all they want to talk about. That's what that is. I'm searching for a way to make sense of something that just doesn't make sense, and I'm really angry that it doesn't make sense. So it's not really a matter of them not wanting to. Now, that's not your job to say, well, I'm going to ask because you need to talk about this person. Don't do that. Don't do that. You would deserve to be knocked into the next county for saying something like that. They get to decide the time. Remember the pace. They set the pace. You don't set the pace. Another one, you shouldn't feel sad as long as your loved one was a Christian when he or she died. They're in a better place. And you know, if a lot of times if grieving people were honest, they would say, well, they're in a better place and I'm not. Because it sucks on this side of heaven, and there's this massive hole left behind in my life. So this idea that we shouldn't feel sad the minute, you know, and I think a lot of you guys have been in enough of my classes, you've heard me rail about that word should all the time. Because it creates a target we can't meet, and it prohibits us usually from being thoroughly human as we are. And when we experience a loss, we grieve. And with key people, we mourn. And so when we get to this place of saying, well, they're in a better place, therefore you shouldn't feel sad, we're denying the feelings that they have. And in a lot of cases, even in a, you know, again, I've been around long enough, I've gone through enough wakes and funerals and things like this, and you know, in a lot of ways, I stay away from wherever the conversations are, because whatever I hear there makes me so irritated. I want to throw them out of the funeral home or something like that. And are people well-meaning? Yeah, but their well-meaning is wasted. Maybe they should have spent some of that effort in being sensitive to what the other person needed rather than what they needed to say. So, you know, they're in a better place. Well, that may be absolutely true. We've talked a little bit about big T and little t truth. But the relational truth is I'm feeling lost because the person's gone. And I don't know how to conduct my life and figure out how to do life at all. So there's always going to be a part of that comes into play in terms of what we're actually talking about and how we understand it. And we have to have those kinds of conversations to go with it. Okay. Another one that comes up, time heals all wounds, including grief. Now I think this one I probably have already ranted about, so I'll spare you, but time doesn't heal anything. Time may give us space to be able to heal, but there still is going to be the work to be done with the healing and the grief. It's really part of the reason why we, in the world of working with people that are grieving, we call it grief work. There needs to be some intentionality to it in processing what I do. There's always at least in the world of grieving, there's always an intentionality piece, and there is a, what do I want to say? A kind of an acceptance piece where I'm going to go through a variety of emotions with the lost relationship I've had. I'm going to do that. And just saying, well, time heals all wounds is a little bit like what I said to you early in the class is you know, I'll just push all these things under the rug, and when it gets too big, just find a bigger rug. And time doesn't heal anything, and particularly when you've had a significant wound. and I mentioned, and I have mentioned before about, you know, the idea that grief is a psychological burn wound. Imagine for a moment somebody having a significant third-degree burn, and you do nothing about it and just say time heals all wounds. We would never even remotely think about doing something like that. And yet, when it comes to the emotional realm, the nature of what that goes on, it goes into, the different rules apply in terms of how we understand it and what we actually do with it when we're talking about these things. So, now if I engage the process, time doesn't heal, but it does give me space to be able to change and grow and and experience different emotions and what goes into it. Another one. Accepting your loved one's death means that it is okay that he or she died. Now, this is another mythology that oftentimes points to a misnomer more than anything. And that misnomer really is about acceptance. Because we have confused the notion that accepting something means condoning something. So I accept it, and that means it's fine. It's no big deal that they died or whatever that is. Of course, the flip side of that is if I get angry, I'm also stuck because people will say, you know, you need to control your emotions. But the accepting your loved one's death means that it's okay that he or she died. Obviously couldn't be further from the truth. It is a myth, clearly. But we have to, again, confront the kind of the distortion that's embedded in here in terms of acceptance. And how distorted we've allowed that actually to become. Because accepting that somebody is gone doesn't mean I'm doing a standing ovation that they left. It has nothing to do with that. Acceptance means living with the reality of it as it is. That's acceptance. Yeah, and when we're talking about loss, that's the one that we wrestle with the most, right? I mean, that's why we do all this pain containment stuff I was talking about. Is I'm not ready to deal with the reality of what that looks like and how that works and really the nature of what goes into it all. So acceptance doesn't mean that. We have to confront part of that. Now, another one here that I think is important is if you say goodbye, it means you won't remember him or her. Now, I will go back to what I shared with you guys at the very, very beginning of this class and in my own process as far as grieving is concerned. And in the process of my dad dying and all of the subsequent years thereafter, I refused to say goodbye. And the irony is in my refusal to say goodbye, I lost memories. Now, you would think, well, that's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? I mean, you don't say goodbye, then why would you lose things? Well, it's a little bit like something that you care a lot about, and you hang on to it so tightly that you choke it off. And that's what happens oftentimes with memories, and we refuse to accept the reality of what's actually happened, and we hang on so tightly that nothing gets out. And there are a number of times that I can recall, even during that time, that first kind of decade that I was dealing with this stuff, that I would look at my mom, I would look at my girlfriend, who's now my wife, and say, I don't remember what my dad sounded like. I can walk out into my backyard and I don't remember anything. And see that the only way we can cope with the pain that memories bring with them is we dissociate and we package it up, put it away, and now it's not there. The process of saying goodbye is almost more problematic because I have to not only deal with the reality of them being gone, but now I have to deal with the reality of them being gone now. Both. And that's why we don't say goodbye. I mean, the irony is even in our relationships now, here and now, there are a number of folks in here that are seniors. The one thing they want to avoid at all costs at the end of graduation is looking somebody in the eye and saying goodbye. As a matter of fact, they won't, probably. Why? Because we don't want to deal with the reality of it. We don't want to think about the thought of not being with that person going into the future. So how do we control the pain? We deny it. We minimize the facts. Is this sounding familiar at all? We mummify the person in our mind, and we go on about our business. And that's a necessary part, but it's also a destructive part, if you want to look at it that way, because of our tendencies around denial and what goes into it. And so goodbye is a necessary part of relationships. I've said this in other classes, some of you may have heard me say this, but quite honestly, I think a lot of our relationships we suffer from shallow relationships because they're not willing to say goodbye. Because all relationships in one form or another have an end. And somehow that, if you'll remember that quote I put up of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, when we live life like there is no end, it is infinite, we miss the opportunities for the fullness of the relationships we have. And that's a embedded part of a lot of what we're talking about with some of this mythology and understanding what goes into it. Saying goodbye, doesn't mean you won't remember. And again, walking back to my process, when I finally got around to saying goodbye, the irony was, and again, this is not prescriptive, this does not mean that everybody does it this way, it doesn't mean that at all. But it was almost as if I had the opportunity to regain the memories I had, because I was so busy choking it off so I didn't feel anything that all the memories didn't come along with it either. And so for me at least, the memories came back. The last one we're looking at, loving someone else means you're being disloyal to the loved one who has died. We got two more. In a lot of cases, we regress in our understanding of love. And what I mean by that is that in a lot of cases when we experience loss, we see love as an additive thing. Okay, so, and kids do this early in their development, that, mom has a pound of love, dad has a pound of love, and they give them to me. And then a sibling is born, and then they say, well, mom and dad don't love me because there's only 2 pounds of love to go around and I don't have them. And we tend to look at it very similarly, so that when I begin to invest in a new relationship, there is this lurking sense of disloyalty to the other person. And you see this a lot in other relationships. I was just talking to somebody over the past week that had somebody in their life, and this person had gone through an engagement, and the engagement got broken, and it left a huge hole. And it was very difficult in the new relationship to start to rebuild the kind of trust that was broken because of the betrayal in the first one. And the other side of it is that most relationships are not uniformly bad. So you have the positive stuff that you're still missing and feel disloyal to. I've had a lot of kids over the years even talking about having losses a little bit like my own. And somebody new comes in, a parent loses a spouse, the kid loses a parent, and the spouse goes out and gets married again. And the kid is like, no, we're not having a relationship, because if I invest in yours, then I'm taking it away from the other. And that comes up within the context of a lot of our relationships in terms of loss as well. When we have a broken relationship, it might be a little bit easier because we like to kind of turn the corner on it. But unfortunately, in a lot of cases, we don't pay enough attention to the injuries that might have happened during that time, and we just kind of go on about our business rather than going back to what we talked about 2 weeks ago. We were talking about forgiveness. And that's usually why I point to the fact that all paths, even in grief, oftentimes lead through forgiveness in terms of understanding where it is and the nature of it. The last one I've got is we slowly and predictably recover from grief and loss. And when you look at some of the newer conceptualizations of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages, what you find is that one conceptualization at least has a loop in each of the stages, and all of them begin to move downward. With kind of the most downward part of it is the depression that somebody experiences. But there's a loop in there, and so it never is reliable. It never is reliably the same. It's not a progressive trend in one fashion or another. I mean, a lot of people literally, I mean, some of you guys were in the crisis and trauma class when John came and he gave this graphic of a ball of yarn, and he referred to it as kind of the ball of grief. And that's a lot of times how it actually feels. It doesn't look nearly as orderly as that graphic. It literally looks like a ball of yarn that somebody has stretched out and just kind of bunched up and thrown together, and it's like, I have no idea where I'm at, and I feel so terrible, and that's where life is right now. And there's nothing predictable. For every person, it's not predictable. And that's what's so annoying. Because if it was predictable, then at least I could explain it. And if I could explain it, I could control it. And if I can control it, I don't have to feel it. Always works well. So we slowly and predictably, in a lot of cases for people, what they do is it's in spurts. There's moments in time where they have a lot of emotions and they do a lot of work at that point in time. And then there's kind of a quiet period, and then they do a lot more work again, and whatever it might be. I mean, one of the things that oftentimes triggers this work is anniversaries. Particularly when you've lost somebody, and an anniversary carries meaning to it. So you cross their birthday, or you cross a holiday, or you cross something else that was a favorite family thing to do. And all of those things kind of trigger all of the emotions that come with it. And really, that's, as hard as it is, that's the time where a lot of the work has to be done. In processing it and talking about it and looking at it and so forth. The last thing I want to end on here, we're going to finish up just a little early, is grief and mourning are the same. And the idea that everyone grieves but not everyone mourns is an important distinction. All of us experience the bond that has been broken, and that usually is where we connect up with grief and the nature of it and how it looks. Mourning ends up being the process that I undergo, usually with others. Remember when I said when we started this class, we were never meant to mourn alone. And at that point I use the word grieve alone. A lot of times people fold these things together. I think in a lot of cases, like this says, everybody grieves and not everybody mourns, partly because it's the public display, if you want to put it that way, behind what we experience and the broken bond that comes with it. So grief and mourning are not the same, and that's kind of key to keep in mind when we're talking about this. Now, before we wrap up, let me stop for a second. First, see if you have any questions about any of these, and then secondly, what I'd like to hear is if there are other mythologies that you guys have heard that I don't have listed up here. And I'd like to just kind of poll the class and see if you've heard things that I didn't mention. But first question, any questions about any of this mythology that we're talking about, or myths or things that are related to grieving somebody? I think a lot of them, once you get them down, you can get a fix on, because it's a myth, how do you walk alongside somebody else? And what kinds of things do you steer away from, for example, when you're engaging them? So any questions or anything? Okay. Yeah.
From an outsider's point of view, if someone experiencing grief, how do you know when they say like they're truly like, I'm okay, like it's been a couple months or like doing really well? How do you know like that's the truth?
Well, you get a polygraph. No. Wait. No, I think all you can do is take them at their word. I think that's always a better route to take, is taking somebody at their word. Now, I think when you look a little bit closer, you might you might say some things are not really adding up here. When somebody says I'm okay, but their emotions don't match. And so I think in that case, a lot of times you ask the kinds of questions that are of the kind, help me understand. You say you're okay, but you're always on the verge of tears when we're talking. That doesn't look okay to me. And that's not that's not being pushy or anything like that. It's just simply inviting somebody to articulate what they're experiencing. The one thing that a lot of times I'll have people say, and I'll remind people to say it, it's okay if you're not okay. It's okay to not be okay. And ironically, it seems like we almost need permission for somebody to tell us that it's okay, versus just being able to do that ourselves. So, any other questions or anything? How about other mythology? Any other things you've heard? People you've been around? How they handled people that were experiencing a loss or mourning in some fashion? Churches you've been in? Pastors you've been around? Worse yet, care pastors you've been around? Anything? Yeah, Dana?
Yeah, like the pain that you're going through is a distraction when you're worshiping God.
It's a distraction from?
Worshiping God.
Oh, worshiping God. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's always nice. I mean, the funny thing about it is, and I've gotten increasingly snarky when I go through loss. Because my response is say, yeah, you're right. And? You're right. Usually the implication is that you shouldn't let your pain distract you from worshiping God. Well, I guess some of that depends on how we go about worshiping God. Because maybe my worship of God is the intimacy enough to wrestle with Him about, I don't like the state I'm in right now. Now, we're very narrow in our little definitions of worship and all of that sort of stuff, and I get that, but I think it's what you point to is really kind of the spiritualization of pain, and inherently somehow pain is a bad thing. Now, usually it is. I fall off the balcony up there and I'm in pain. That's a good thing. It tells me I've done something wrong. On the other hand, pain that is connected to the love I felt for somebody else isn't wrong. As a matter of fact, it's not really even a distraction. It's an indication of my humanity. And I'm not sure that I really want to bust somebody for being human. Because before too long, I want to look in a mirror. So there's always that. But yeah, that's a good one, actually. Yeah. Sarah Jane, were you going to say one?
I was going to say, if you're not being emotional, then you're not grieving.
Yeah. Yes, that's a very good one. The idea of emotion display is the only indication of the grieving process. It's part of it, but it's not the only one. I mean, in a lot of cases, even that reweaving thing that I was talking about before, some of that is cognitive. It's kind of a reorientation of beliefs and understandings of what's going on. It may not trigger emotions. And so, yeah, we tend to paint these things in really black and white terms. So if you're emotional, that means you're grieving. And if you're not, then you're okay. I think killing somebody over there? It's clinical counseling methods. What do you expect? So, yeah, and I think that has to come into play as well. So, yeah. Any other mythologies or phrases or comments you've heard people say in regards to grieving or anything? Yes, ma'am.
I think it's interesting, the point you were saying, like we just assume that they don't want to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really practical point, especially just like with people I know that are grieving, you just assume like that's like an off base like topic. You don't want to like ask them like how they're doing because you just assume it's bad or like that they don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to hear that like talking about it could actually help instead of just like make it worse.
Yeah, I mean, it literally, to some degree, it's kind of that cleaning out of the wound kind of thing. Now, they could say, I don't want to talk about it. That's fine. But I think you actually communicate something just by asking. I think in a lot of cases, particularly with people that have lost somebody, 4 or 5 weeks out, they're feeling pretty isolated. And in a lot of cases, I end up looking at, when I check in with people that I know that have lost somebody, I'll check in at the 5 or 6 week mark. Because everybody has moved on with their life and forgotten that they're still grieving. So, anything else? Any other reactions or comments or things you've heard? Okay, well we will dive into the models the next time. Start unpacking one of them, and I will see you then.